Japan, an island nation known for its wild animation, strict cultural norms, and intense transphobia. And sometimes, when the stars align and the gates of relay open, you can see all three at once. Perhaps that last bit is less famous, but yes, like much of the world, Japan has systemic issues with its gender non-conforming citizens. If you've ever wondered about how trans people get by there, but you want to hear about it from an American, you've come to the right video. As it turns out, transphobia is pretty big in Japan. And what better way to discuss the multifaceted means by which trans people are discriminated against in Japan than through a numbered list.
Number 5, Japanese homogeneity.
One of the overarching criticisms of Japanese society that underpins and transcends the specific issues of non-normative gender identities is what we're here calling Japanese homogeneity. If you have a passing understanding of Japan, you've probably heard of these concerns before. Japan focuses on a uniform group rather than the individual. This is great for businesses since it fosters a culture of working intensely hard for the good of the group, but it's less good for anyone who expresses their individuality, willingly or not, by sticking out. People that are considered different, who don't fit into the strict confines of prescribed Japanese society, face a myriad of backlashes. Even something as innocuous as hair color can lead to systemic pressure. In Japanese schools, hair color and style are monitored to maintain uniformity. This politically minded advertisement for shampoo and hair dye company Pantene later included a roundtable discussion between a number of teachers, in which one of them says, "The school says dyeing your hair black is good to make sure you won't have to deal with more trouble." If you can face trouble for having brown hair, imagine the kinds of issues you'll run into if you're transgender. Actually, don't imagine it, because we're gonna describe it. At worst, you'll be ridiculed, bullied, and perhaps assaulted, kicked out, murdered, or driven to suicide. In Masami Tamagawa's essay, Coming Out of the Closet in Japan, an exploratory sociological study, link in the description, Tamagawa highlights the two main modes of queerphobia in Japan, both of which tie directly into the homogeneity of Japanese culture. The first is quiet homophobia, which is present in public life. While homophobia is not explicitly stated, it underpins the entirety of public life, as everyone is expected to take on tatamiya, or a public stance, where they suppress their feeling and initial responses in favor of what the group finds acceptable. Meanwhile, homophobia is allowed and encouraged to be stated outright in familial contexts. The family is considered the basic unit of Japanese society, and one's family is the only place where one is allowed to take off the public stance and express oneself freely. However, this means familial places are key battlegrounds for the maintenance of heteronormativity, as failing to do so may lead to the queering of the family home. A 2015 study showed that 40% of parents would be uncomfortable with their children coming out to them. As Tamagawa states, because of a strong Confucian influence, the maintenance and continuation of the family is considered one of the most important aspects of Japanese families. Under such societal and cultural conditions, some Japanese parents impose difficult demands on their GLBT children. For example, some Japanese parents require their GLBT children to lead heteronormative lives by marrying and having children, thus producing grandchildren for them. Tamagawa's survey showed that more than half of the LGBT people surveyed had only come out to a few people, if at all. Furthermore, the majority of participants didn't know of any openly LGBT public figures they could look up to, yet again highlighting the homogeneity of Japanese culture. This is especially tragic because, as Tamagawa's data shows, the LGBT participants who did come out often felt better about their identities and psychological health. Coming out is generally a beneficial experience, and the intense stigma around it causes many LGBT people to suffer in silence. That said, coming out is not sunshine and rainbows for everyone. Circling back to the focus of our little video, trans people face particularly harsh consequences for coming out. As Tamagawa puts it, this study found that far more trans women worried that they would be bullied and, in fact, were bullied after coming out than other GLBT subgroups. Furthermore, their view of their gender identity was more negative than that of any other GLBT subgroup.
Number 4. Imperialism.
Preceding World War II, Japan had a sizable publications industry centered around unabashed dialoguing on sexuality. Media featuring sexual candor and what we would now label as queer representation gathered a significant audience. This included everything from journals that paraded their wealth of sexual knowledge to articles and advice pages offered up by up-and-coming sexual experts. Additionally, gender non-conforming communities found themselves thriving since the dawn of the Edo period in 1603. A whole ass 416 years ago, and your local smug, contrarian, logic-obsessed white dude is still pretending like gender nonconformity is a new thing. Thanks, Ben Shapiro. Of course, militarization and imperialism has quite the track record of instilling constructive cultural shifts. I mean, when have aggro men ever got it wrong? To put things into perspective, the word sex was included in at least 6 publicly renowned journals in the 1920s, but preceding the rise of militarism in the 1930s, the growth of sexual education in media experienced quite the intermission. And, surprise, surprise, after the war, the Allied occupation abolished major restrictions on media in Japan that suppressed portrayals of sexual freedom. Just like that, publications representing quote-unquote perverse sexuality were free to breathe uninhibited. We'll feel free to dive into facts that just might subvert your discount Ben Shapiro's being trans is a made-up millennial thing rhetoric. By the 1950s, reviewed magazines in Japan were churning out what your racist uncle might refer to as salacious content. Everything from perverse fetishes, gender bending, and non-heterosexuality. A notable example being the magazine Kitan Kurabu, or Strange Talk Club, which was published from 1950 to 1975. It featured explicit illustrations and dialogues on homosexuality and what our modern Western vernacular would call drag. Men dressed in conventionally feminine clothing was referred to as jososha, which directly translated to female dressers. Content centered on trans topics was portrayed by publications such as Fuzoku Kagaku, Sex Custom Science, Fuzoku Zoshi, Sex Custom Storybook, and Uramado, Rear Window. And this is a part of Japanese history that cannot be erased or ignored. These publications portrayed gender nonconformity outside the confines of essentialist, whitewashed, and medicalized models of gender, and it provided an outlet for queer folk to find each other, explore various sexual practices, and even literally provide discussion services. In the February 1955 issue of Fuzoku Kagaku, there was even a section called Guide to Sodom that instated multiple coffee shops for gay men to find each other and engage in constructive conversations. Now that we've addressed the historical and cultural significance of queer culture in pre- and post-war Japan, let's talk about the fun stuff: imperialism and Western influence. The integration of the word gay in Japan is an example of cultural borrowing that occurred due to the mass mobilization of U.S. forces in the war, as it permeated Japanese vernacular through gay men in the occupation forces. Sex change operations gained more mainstream attention when the 1959 French film Europe d'une Note reached Japanese audiences when released as Yoruba no Yoru in 1961. As the movie depicted the nightlife of the trans singer Kosunila Le Carousel, who had undergone medical procedures, the normalization of the medical model ensued. As the Western practice of sex change procedures experienced an upswing in exposure to Japanese media, the notion that gender dysphoria should be classified as a medical disorder gained momentum as well. We may or may not expand on this on number 2 on the list. To give perspective, trans experiences still saw representation in Japanese media in the 50s and 60s, in a time where Anglo-Saxon cultures strayed away from this due to fear of censorship. However, due to Western influence on Japanese culture after the war, The desire for Japanese trans folk to undergo surgery grew as the Euro-American gender binary dictated that sex change procedures were the golden ticket to legal and social acceptance as a cis-passing trans folk. Oh, assimilationism and Western imperialism, always enforcing the most totally not harmful cultural norms.
Number 3. Discrimination.
Speaking of cultural norms, discrimination. Children in Japan are socialized into a very rigid mold of acceptable behavior, and when they see that mold defied or broken, they reinforce it with bullying and abuse. Bullying in Japan is actually some of the most intense, and teachers will sometimes go to great lengths to cover it up, dismiss it, and may even participate. The abuse doesn't stop after graduation either, as up to 45.8% of LGBT people see and or hear discriminatory language and behavior at work. It is a saying in Japan that the nail that sticks out gets hammered in, and that sentiment is reflected throughout it. This intense need to suppress and hurt is the reason that of a sample of over 1,000 LGBT people, 50% of trans people in said sample contemplated death and suicide. This is a full 10% higher than the rate in the US. Now, so far, we've talked a lot about how LGBT youth are treated by society at large, but as it turns out, there's also trouble at home. Remember those strict societal expectations? School children and coworkers aren't the only people to enforce them. Parents, and especially fathers, do it too. Dads are the heads of the household and are expected to keep things nice, normal, and on the straight and narrow. This means that if a child is LGBT and especially T, they are likely to be treated far worse at home. This could range from neglect and shunning to beating and starvation. Now, these parents are obviously also terrible people, but to ignore the societal influences on this behavior and only blame individuals presents a roadblock in actually changing how LGBT people are perceived and treated in Japan. This behavior doesn't come from nowhere, it is socialized into people, and...
Number 2. Medicalization.
Perception is an especially huge issue for trans people living in Japan because it is the crux of their struggle for gender satisfaction and affirmation. Passing, the idea of embodying the ideal of the gender one identifies with, isn't enough though. It is impossible to change the gender marker on any identification without undergoing sexual reassignment surgery. And forget about if you're non-binary. There's certainly no third gender category to put on your identification, and likely the only support you'll get is from other people who have the same non-normative gender identity as you. Binary trans folks also have to navigate around the lack of gender therapy specialists and the limited understanding that modern Japanese psychiatry has on transness. This isn't even really transphobia so much as it is ignorance and plain and simple. There is some progress in this area, though we'll touch on that later. For now, there still remains this huge stigma and misunderstanding of trans people, and they have to undergo expensive procedures they don't want in order to be affirmed in that one sliver of their lives, while maybe still being denied service from clinics and hospitals and contending with the social cost of transition. And that's not all, because what would compelled surgery be without forced sterilization?
Number 1. Sterilization.
Trans people are forcibly sterilized when they medically transition. Let's let that sink in. Trans people are humiliated their entire lives, often bullied by classmates and made to feel wrong and ugly, told that they are insane and mentally ill and utterly aberrant. They finally begin to transition, and then on top of a compulsory surgery, they are stripped of the ability to ever have children of their own. In order to be seen as the gender that they are, they must give up their reproductive rights. As same-sex marriage is still illegal, the only way for heterosexual trans people to get married is to have all the surgeries done and then be sterilized. Otherwise, there exists no legal ties to their partners and any children they have. As an example, if a trans man who refused to be sterilized has a partner who gives birth to a child, he isn't considered the father legally because he is still considered female and thus in a same-sex relationship. Since same-sex marriage is still illegal, he's only considered a roommate to his partner and child, as his partner is considered a single mother. This is the true story of a trans man named Fumino Sugiyama. He's fighting for trans rights on the front lines, and his is one of many similar stories about unfairness, discrimination, and the strange medical nature of transition in Japan. There is some hope out there, though, even if it's just the small stuff.
Part 2. Neurodiversity.
Neurodiversity is an organization focused on creating an increasingly safe Japan for queer people of all kinds. They are mainly concerned with the public spheres of school and work, and their work consists mainly of educational sessions and sensitivity training to reduce the outward appearance of homophobia and transphobia. They also host LGBT-friendly events and hold meetings to discuss policy and reform ideas. They also take surveys of the LGBTQ populace and try to push forward the presence and existence of queer folks as normal, everyday, and completely harmless. Which is only mostly true. Quirkiness aside, Nidro also provides consultation to companies about how better to support their queer workers and fight discrimination. The work they do is very important, especially in a conservative country like Japan, but it's also vital to critique organizations so that we don't fall into the trap of thinking that they're perfect just because they contribute to some social good.
Part 3. Critique and support.
Nidro may be helping LGBT people, but their methods are utterly reformist. They don't challenge oppressive systems directly, instead working within them to mitigate the suffering of those who would be hurt by things like transphobia and homophobia. The problem here is that they are formulating their approach in a way where queer people will always be at the mercy of those who aren't. The straight cis populace is always going to be in control, and Nidro has to cater to them in order to get anything done. Nidro has to be kind and gentle to everyone they educate, or they'll never get anything done, so they can't actually challenge the oppressive society that has caused all this pain, unlike here in the United States. On the other hand, a revolution isn't always possible in a world run by powerful people. Sometimes the best you can do is social reform and gentle scolding. It's pretty clear that rebellion wouldn't be acceptable in Japan at all, and if Nidra were to push the envelope, they might just end up making things worse for LGBT people. That's kind of the problem, isn't it? We live in a complex world where those who are oppressed have incentives not to fight their oppressors because the alternative is so much worse. After all, being forced to have expensive surgeries is bad enough. It would be worse if trans people were all institutionalized and forced to undergo conversion therapy, which is just torture. It's just torture. It's just torture. So in the end, we fight for scraps. We'd hate to leave this on a downer note, though, so here's some good stuff, actually. Nidro and organizations like it are making a difference, even if incrementally. And Japan is changing for the better. The majority of Japanese people now support legalized same-sex marriage, which would also help out trans people in a really unaffirming way. As education campaigns continue to teach people about the LGBT community, it could very well be that forced sterilization could be a thing of the past. People die if they are killed, so maybe don't kill them? Crazy idea, I know, but it's true. Prejudice still infects governments and societies the world over, and Japan is no exception. We live in a complex, unfair world, but organizations like Nidro are working to make it a better place. And if you feel the inclination, there will be a donation link to them below. Remember that together we can do so much more than we can apart. Everyone's oppression is bound up together, and improving the lives of those who are disadvantaged will help everyone else too. So do, and do well.
The end.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.